So as everyone knows, and hopefully you've all voted, today is Election Day. And given that it's Election Day, we thought we'd help you put everything into context. So joining us from Berkeley's Political Science Department is Professor Paul Pierson in conversation with our former co-host, Professor Stavros Gadinis. Please join me in welcoming our guests.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Paul. Thank you very much for joining us today. So Paul is the Joan Gross Professor of Political Science at Berkeley, coming to us from Harvard in 2004. He is our preeminent expert in American politics, particularly the politics of the welfare state and the rise of conservatism. But he also has a great sense of humor, judging by the title of his latest book, which is Let Them Eat Tweets, which talks about political communication in an era of inequality. So, Paul, thanks very much for joining us in this day. Today, of course, we're all waiting to see what kind of country we will wake up in tomorrow. And it looks like, if prognostics are right, that Republicans are going to have the upper hand in this election. Does this surprise you at all?
So I wanted to just start by saying it's a rough job to be asked to prognosticate hours before the polls close. Like it's much like if I did it a month ago or something, you'd all have forgotten what I said. And I'm not really a prognosticator. You should trust what you read on whatever your favorite poll aggregating site is.
Oh, pollsters always get it right.
Well, right. So we can talk about that a little bit. I mean, if we had been talking a month ago, I think what I would have wanted to say is that the interesting question is why the Democrats are doing as well as they are. Like why they're not getting completely blown out. Because if you look at all the recent elections where one party had unified control of the government and they're in a midterm election, it's just a steady record of blowouts. Whether 1994, 2006, 2010, 2018, all these elections are blowouts, at least in the House. And you put that together with Biden's approval rating, which is about what Trump's approval rating was in 2018, and you would think Democrats are going to get crushed. And incredibly sour mood in the country, and the scores on do you think the country's going in the wrong direction, super high. All of these things would lead you to just think, based on those basic but important indicators, the Democrats are going to get blown out in this election. And I would say if you looked at it a month or two ago, you would have said, well, they're not. They're actually not getting, they're extremely competitive in the Senate, favored to maintain control of the Senate, which means they're either not losing any seats or they're potentially gaining seats. And House losses we're seeing as being, they're probably going to lose the House, but maybe minimally. I do feel like things have changed in the last month. We're going to know shortly. And there is uncertainty because polling has gotten really hard. Like I think it's really important when you talk about the pollsters to recognize it's not that our pollsters are worse than they used to be. I'm sure they're better than they used to be. It's become much more sophisticated. It's become extremely difficult to poll because response rates have dropped to almost nothing, and so you're kind of scratching your head trying to figure out who are those people who aren't answering the phone, right? And what do they think? And are they going to turn out for the election or not? And there's just enormous uncertainty around that. So even tonight, I would say there remains quite a bit of uncertainty because the margins in, I think there are 8 Senate races where the margins in the polls are pretty tight. And so a little polling error one direction or another is really going to change the outcome. Typically, those break and they don't just split like, oh, we underestimated the Republicans in these 4 races and we overestimated them in the other 4 races. It doesn't usually work that way. These aren't completely independent what's going on. And so, like I said, you could end up seeing things swing pretty significantly, and just based on what's been going on the last few weeks, I think it's more likely to be for the GOP.
So what were the factors that kind of made you think at first that Democrats could hold on to some of their seats? And what has changed in the last month that has pushed Republicans further up?
Yeah, so Ron Braunstein, the reporter, in LA, reports for The Atlantic and CNN, has this nice phrase where he calls it a double negative election. They were having a double negative election. So we've already talked about the negatives for the Democrats. The negatives for the Republicans are also, usually a midterm election is a referendum on the party that's perceived as being in power, so you would think the negatives about the Democrats would dominate. But there are also significant negatives about the Republicans. There is, I think, a lot in polling that suggests that people are worried about the Republican Party. They don't feel enthusiastic about, obviously some people feel very enthusiastic about it, but the median voter doesn't feel enthusiastic about it. Donald Trump is quite unpopular, actually. If you look, his negatives are higher than Biden's negatives are. And so that I think is an important factor. And the other factor is the quality of Republican candidates. There are a number of races. Mitch McConnell has talked about this, right? So basically grumbling about the quality of the candidates in some of these races. That probably doesn't matter that much in the House. It may not matter that much in the Senate because voting has become so tribal that people, they just don't care anymore what the character is of the particular candidate and whether they think they have a good temperament to be a senator, they have a good preparation to be a senator. They're just going to vote for their party. But there is this idea that the quality of some of the candidates who emerged on the Republican side might cost them a few percent in a few of these races, and a few percent can make the difference between winning and losing. So those were the negatives on the Republican side that produced this some slightly surprising dynamic, I think. And I guess I would we'll know more tomorrow, but my sense is that in the last month or so, the negatives on the Democratic side, which are the more predictable ones, they're the more conventional kinds of things that you would expect to see in a midterm election where one party is, I hesitate to call them in control because with the filibuster and so on, it's not like the Democrats totally control what's happening in Washington, but they are, on paper and in I think popular perception, it's like, well, you have a Democratic president, you have a Democratic Senate, you have a Democratic House. The Democrats are running things. People are grumpy. I think at the end, and as people who hadn't yet made their decisions make their decisions in the last week or two, that seems to be pointing towards the Republicans.
So these midterms happen at a moment of intense anxiety, I would say. So there's rising inflation, there's housing market anxiety, there's international conflict. Now, what do we know about how a set of circumstances like this one actually affects election outcomes? Do they favor the party that's in power? Do they favor the party that's challenging them? And in terms of the message that voters are trying to send, what are they trying to say in these moments?
So there used to be a conventional wisdom of political scientists that basically you could look and see what happened to real income or GDP growth in the 9 months before the election, and you could tell a lot from knowing that. And the confidence about that, I think, has deteriorated in the last 10 years or so, partly that's because, again, there's so much tribalism that most voters are pretty locked in on their party, and even they'll either deny that things are going badly if that would hurt their candidate, or they'll explain it away by saying it's not really their fault, it's the other guy's fault. And so what's actually happening in the economy, reality seems to matter less in American politics than it once did. But the overall balance of negative economic news. So the other thing I think that's different now is trying to figure out whether the economy is doing well or badly has actually been pretty complicated lately, right? It was complicated in 2020 with the pandemic where by some measures, so like unemployment, those numbers look really bad for the president. But real income growth, because the government was funneling so much money into the economy, real income growth was actually really high in 2020. So figuring out, what does that mean for how voters are going to react is quite unclear. And in this case, you have a situation where actually unemployment is extremely low, right, by historical standards, lowest it's been in half a century, basically. But the inflation rate is high, right, which we haven't seen in a long time. And at least if you just look at people's, what people say in polls about how they feel about the economy, the inflation numbers are trumping the unemployment numbers. And you sort of understand why that's happening. It affects everybody, right? and it's very visible to people. So people are definitely feeling down in the economy, and I would expect that's going to hurt the Democrats.
Okay, so now let's move to a slightly different set of questions that have to do with elections themselves. So we are experiencing a moment where there are actual doubts about the integrity of elections in the US. And that kind of translates into a general concern about the future of democracy. And according to some recent polls, about 70% of Americans feel that democracy itself is at risk. This is something relatively new for the US. So what does it mean for the election?
Yeah. So that's a great question. I'm glad we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about it. And to start with the voters, and then we can talk about what I think are some of the deeper challenges going on for American democracy and concerns about American democracy. But to start with, like you say, 70%, right, of Americans now say they think democracy is at risk, which is that's a stunning number. But I think in a lot of ways it is a proxy for the broader polarization, the intensity of the polarization that has taken place in the United States in the last few decades, which seems to just continue to ratchet up. And that takes very strongly a form of what political scientists call negative polarization or affective polarization, which basically means you hate the other side. Right? You might actually have pretty ambivalent feelings about your own side and your own leaders, but you definitely hate the other side. And you see them as a threat. Right? You see them as a threat to things that you really cherish. Right? And so when people say they fear for democracy, Republicans say that and Democrats say that. They say it for quite different reasons. Right? And in both cases, I think it's very closely tied to this general sense that the other side is dangerous, that the other side is a threat. And so that's where that number comes from. But like I said, I think there are deeper issues about that actually do have to do with the idea that democracy itself might be in danger that we should talk about.
Let's get to those deeper issues. Are these fears about the future of American democracy really justified? It's kind of hard for me to imagine the U.S. being dominated by an authoritarian ruler in the type of Putin or Hungary or Turkey. That's kind of hard to imagine happening very soon. Am I wrong about that?
Yeah, I think you're wrong.
Okay.
It's very nice of you to invite me to tell you that. But so yeah, no, I think it's a serious concern, and just to say at the outset, I realize this is like delicate territory. People have strong views about it. You start talking about it and you can seem biased really quickly. But what I want to suggest, I'm thinking about that. There's a Orwell line where he says, "Seeing what's right in front of your nose needs a constant struggle." Right? That's especially, things are really noisy out there right now, and there are a lot of people who try to make a lot of noise to make it hard to figure out what's going on. But I think that my job as an analyst is not to have the posture of objectivity in which you say this party, that party, it's all the same, but to really try to figure out what does the evidence suggest, but also to recognize that we're all potentially biased about this. But there was a piece in the New York Times this morning, an op-ed piece written by a very good political scientist who was saying, it's a terrible thing when candidates don't concede, right, and don't acknowledge how elections work and the importance of the turnover of power, and which is a really important point, and totally agree with it. But you could have read that piece, had a lot of smart things in it, without having any idea whether this is an issue that was stronger for Republicans or for Democrats, right? It seemed, you read this piece and you could think this applies to both political parties. And I just think that's kind of a posture of objectivity to me, but it's not actual objectivity, right? Which is to look at the evidence. And I think there's a lot of reason to be concerned. I mean, I think we know, I think the facts are pretty clear that a sitting president basically tried to engineer a coup to stay in office. It wasn't very well organized, right? and it ended up not being effective. But that's kind of a big deal. Like I always say, like, think if it were happening in another country, what would you think about what was going on with the political system in that country? So there was an attempt, and it had multiple levels to it. It wasn't just January 6th. There were multiple efforts that were made on to try to swing, the result in his favor and find a way to push it through, even though he clearly had lost the election, right? So that's a big deal. That person is the leading candidate in the Republican Party to be president again, right? Now, whether or not, I mean, obviously it's a big deal if he becomes president for democracy, but even if he doesn't become president, it tells you a lot about what's going on in the Republican Party, that even after this kind of experience, that people would double down, right, in support of him. And in addition to that, we think about the shakeout in the Republican Party since the election in January 6th. There effectively has been something close to a purge of the party, right? But it's not a purge of the people who were interested in rejecting the election results. It's the purge of the people who stood up to that, right? It's the purge, obviously, the people who voted in favor of impeachment. 8 of the 10 are gone now, right? There's a chance another one will lose today, right? The only one who survived out of luck, which is that the more far right Republicans split the vote when they were trying to take this person out in a primary. It wasn't because there was broad support for what the person had done. Almost half of the people who voted, Republicans who voted to certify the election in 2020, are now out, right? Either retiring or they've been defeated in primaries. Same for the 35 Republicans who voted for the January 6th commission. Almost half of them are now either have been defeated in primaries or they retired. Right? So the party is changing very quickly in a direction, in the direction that doesn't seem to me, super compatible with democratic stability. And so one possibility, like you say, is a sort of strongman possibility. Donald Trump's not in office. When he's not in office, he can't do that. But in the American political system, I think there are also risks of what is political scientists now call democratic backsliding, of kind of slow erosions of democratic procedures. It's easy to imagine big issues around the certification of a presidential election, just like what happened in 2020, but with a lot more support in critical swing states, in Republican states in 2024. It's really easy to see how that could happen and how it could be supported by House Republicans with the new caucus or potentially by the Supreme Court, depending on what the circumstances were. And then finally, there's another danger, I think, which is a kind of slow slide where you get to, where there's no moment, right, where there's a sharp break, but just you keep tilting the playing field in such a way that it really advantages one political party over the other political party. And arguably that has been happening in the US over the last 10 years or so. If you look at the Supreme Court's voting rights decisions, Citizens United, there's now a lot of evidence to suggest that the Citizens United decision helped Republicans quite significantly in terms of their financial resources and their electoral capacities. The Gadinis decision, which had a big effect on labor unions, which tend to support Democrats, the refusal to get involved in gerrymandering, all of these decisions have made it, have tilted the playing field in some places in really significant ways. I'll end with this, but the Republican candidate for governor the other day said, if I'm elected, Republicans will never lose in Wisconsin again. Right? And that is just a weird thing for a candidate in a democracy to say, I think. And it's happening in a state where Republicans can win 45 to 48% of the vote in state legislative elections and have over 60% of the seats because of how gerrymandered the state is. So I think there's a lot of reason to worry.
Okay, well, so I'd like to move on to the impact of the election on businesses. So if the polls are right and the Republicans do win, then we're probably going to end up with a divided government of some sort, which typically means that the legislative machine grinds to a halt, even more than it is right now. And this, if I were President Biden, I wouldn't be very happy about it. But as a business, that usually means that there's no new regulation, there's no new taxes, and that generally the legal climate remains stable, as it were right before the election. So that doesn't sound pretty bad for businesses. So besides the control about the concerns about democracy, what is the impact of this divided government on businesses? Is it positive, negative?
So if it were I would just say I think it's more complicated, right?
Okay.
If it were 1990, then I would have said what you just described made a lot of sense. But here are a couple of things that I think one needs to think about in addition to that. So gridlock is likely to be the result. But there's one important piece of that, which is the possibility of defaulting on the debt, right? Which is going to be kind of a big deal for the business community if that happens. And of course, it's impossible to predict. We went through an episode of this after the 2012 election. 2010 election, but it can be. I think there's more reason to worry about that now than there would have been then, because I think the Republican caucus has changed quite dramatically, right? So that it's mostly Tea Party and post-Tea Party Republicans who are much more. I don't really like to use the word conservative because I don't think that actually fits very well for the moment that we're at. They're more disruptive. They're more interested in disrupting business as usual, and the debt ceiling rules give them an important lever that's highly consequential. And on the other side, I think Democrats are going to be much less likely than Obama was to say, let's bargain. We'll make a bunch of concessions so that you don't send the financial system over the cliff. I think they feel like that was really bad. That paying that kind of ransom actually was not a good strategy either for the country or for the party. And I think, given the changes in the Democratic Party and Biden's experience with that, I think they're unlikely to do that again. So the risks go up if they're not willing to compromise on this issue. The second thing I would say is gridlock in Congress is not the same as policy gridlock. Right? I think that's important to recognize in the current context. It transfers authority. If Congress can't do anything, it transfers authority to places that can do things. And I think the big players, especially with a Democrat in the White House who can be checked pretty much by the courts, the big players in this are going to be the courts and state governments, who face far fewer restrictions on what they can do. So I would say for the business community in that respect, it depends on how you feel about this Supreme Court, which has strong views, a pretty energetic agenda of its own around concerns that affect the business community. How you feel about them, being the main show in terms of shaping national policy beyond the Fed, of course. And then just the last thing I would say about this is, so you said it'd make Joe Biden unhappy to have gridlock, but there is a silver lining in all this for Biden, which is like if you just wanted to think about what are the prospects of him or some other Democrat being elected to the presidency in 2024, losing control of Congress actually, I think, pretty clearly helps him. Right? I think you look back to 1994 when Bill Clinton had to basically plead that he was still relevant, right? When the Democrats just got wiped out, or Obama's shellacking, is that what they called it in 2010? I think he said it was a shellacking, where those presidents looked really weak and like maybe they were done, but were actually able to get on much surer footing once they had a Republican opposition in Congress, including an opposition that often was doing things that weren't that popular. And I would expect this Republican House, if it emerges, to do a number of things that probably wouldn't be very popular, try to do things that wouldn't be very popular. That's a much better target for an incumbent, a beleaguered incumbent who's trying to run for re-election. So that's down the road, but I think that's another possible impact of this election.
So since we're on the topic of business, there's another question I wanted to ask you, because something that's really striking to me about this election is that businesses, which traditionally were the allies of the Republican Party, are now being increasingly targeted by Republicans. There is a concern about woke corporations. We talked about that this morning with Doug Parker. And generally, you hear Republicans complaining about their power and their influence, and that's kind of a striking reversal of roles. So first, I was wondering, is this real? Are we really talking about Republicans moving away from their traditional allies, or is it just performative because it helps them with their base, but it's not going to translate into real action against corporations? But at the same time, it seems to harken back to old American fears about the powers of trusts, the powers of corporations, and kind of there's this clash between the pro-business profile that the U.S. has always had with this concern about powerful economic actors.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a question where I think I'm changing my mind, just as I've been watching this over the last few months. I think my position 6 months ago would have been, this is mostly cheap talk, right? Trump, of course, had this kind of populist rhetoric, but I would say, in most respects, a big subject, but in most respects, ran a pretty business-friendly administration. The tax cuts being a centerpiece, appointing the kinds of Supreme Court judges that would make, I think, many members of the business community pretty happy. So it was a kind of Chamber of Commerce friendly, in many ways, agenda. But I am changing my mind. I actually think there is something more real going on here. I was struck the other day when Kevin McCarthy basically called for the head of the Chamber of Commerce, because the Chamber had the temerity to endorse a handful of Democrats. I mean, overwhelmingly, the endorsements of the Chamber go to the Republican Party, but a handful of Democrats they had endorsed in 2020, and this apparently was seen as such a violation that that McCarthy wanted to remove the head of the Chamber of Commerce. That's a pretty striking development for an organization that's long been a very strong ally of the party. The establishment wing of the Republican Party is getting weaker. Public opinion polls show that Republican voters have a much less positive view of corporations than they did even a few years ago. Much less positive, which is striking. And then the last thing that makes me wonder about this is that the Republicans increasingly raise campaign funds directly from super wealthy people. Right? So the idea, so there was this old idea that corporations on the whole put more money into the Republican Party than they did the Democratic Party. That helped to give them clout within the party. 20% of the money that Republicans, at least 20% of the money that Republicans have had in this very, very expensive campaign that we're in the middle of, historically unprecedented, 20% comes from billionaires. Right? Presumably, a good chunk of it also comes from people who only have, $800 million. Okay. So, but that is an astonishing thing. But it suggests to me that there may be more room for Republican politicians to kind of lean into this.
You mentioned populism before, and I wanted to ask, it seems to me that Republicans are not the only ones that are being populist. Something striking about this election is that Democrats are leaning more populist as well, because we tend to think about differences between the two parties, but this is a similarity between the two.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are similarities. I think the Democratic Party has moved left on economics, and I think even if you look, but at least in what they tried to do in Congress, and if you look at the kinds of appointments that Biden has made, I think I would say that there's a fundamental difference. I think the Democrats are getting more populist on policy. I think the
See
Republicans are very populist on rhetoric, but it's not clear what that means in terms of policy. There are ways that, like, what is the Republican Party, like, you know, they didn't have a platform in 2020, you know, which is pretty you know, you know, all the stuff that we used to think was going to happen in national conventions, they didn't even bother with it. It's hard to know what they really want to do, and I would say, and you know, you're hearing now about what they want to use the debt ceiling crisis that they're going to instigate to do is to cut entitlement spending, basically, and potentially to get some more tax cuts, right? Which doesn't sound all that populist. But I think there's no question that there's more kind of anti-corporate or kind of, you know, or the corporate voices have probably less weight than they've had in both parties, but for somewhat different reasons.
Well, we've set the scene, I think, for this election, and we'll all be waiting to see what happens tonight and how our predictions bear out in the next few months. Paul, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. It's great to be here.